Some brands offer you low finance, or cashback, or servicing.
Renault don't do ors. We do ands. The Renault Kadjar with 1.91% APR and €1,000 cashback and 3 years servicing, saving you thousands. Renault, the brand with the ands. Visit your local Renault dealer. Finance is made under a hire purchase agreement. Terms and conditions apply. Deposit required. Subject to lending criteria. See Renault.ie.
Hey, this is James Arnold Taylor, voice actor, the voice of
Yabba Dabba Doo, Fred Flintstone,
Johnny Test, who's 11 years old and totally awesome,
Ratchet from Ratchet and Clank, Tidus from Final Fantasy X. Oh, yes, and of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi. It wouldn't be Coffee with Kenobi without yours truly. The force is strong here indeed. Previously on Coffee with Kenobi.
I couldn't believe on a Sunday morning, everybody cheered when the Falcon showed up. Like a character showing up from a long lost past. It was just amazing.
Or like when you see the Batmobile or a new toaster.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, or, Knight Rider or...
Which is not... That's more of a because I'm talking. Yeah. Let's not do it.
Yeah. All right, move on.
I love it.
Right.
I love it.
This is James Arnold Taylor, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi. I have a good feeling about this.
The never-ending saga of the debate over whether the Falcon is a character or not. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Coffee with Kenobi, show number 152. We are your spoiler-free place for Star Wars discussion, analysis, rhetoric, and the best travel tips this side of the galaxy. A very happy Thanksgiving to each and every one of you. I hope you're enjoying a great day with family, friends, and fun, and probably some football in there as well. I'm your host, Dan Z, drinking One Nation coffee out of a black Kylo Ren mug from Hallmark that came out during The Force Awakens. I just rediscovered this beauty the other day in my attic, and I was very excited, so we had to wash that up and drink out of it as we record this show. Coffee with Kenobi is brought to you by MEI and Mouse Fan Travel. For all of your travel needs to the Disney theme parks and cruise lines, as well as anywhere you want to go on vacation, be sure to go to www.mousefantravel.com, the official travel agency of Coffee with Kenobi. On CWK, I invite you to join me as we think about the mythology of Star Wars in a whole new way, and maybe laugh a little bit in the process. You are here with your Star Wars family as we go to our favorite coffee shop and talk Star Wars. On today's very special show, Michael Witwer, the author of Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana, a visual history, joins us as we go through the history of the game, this book, and its incredible connections to Star Wars. So pull up a chair, grab your favorite coffee mug, and let's have some coffee with Kenobi.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first?
Joining us today for a cup of coffee is the author of Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana, a visual history, Michael Witwer. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you, Dan. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, as am I. Happy to chat with you, sir. It's been fun getting to know you just through this process of booking someone to come on the show, because you have this wonderful area of knowledge that so many of our Coffee with Kenobi family members are so passionate about. Of course, Star Wars will be the main thing that's this Coffee with Kenobi. But Dungeons & Dragons is something that's certainly taken our worlds by storm, and it's a big deal, clearly. But before we get to that, let's start on all things Star Wars. Tell me about sort of your love of Star Wars, where that came from, and all of that good stuff.
So Star Wars was kind of my first love, right? Certainly Sam's first love, my brother Sam Witwer. So we got into Star Wars very early, as a lot of people like us did. We were watching the movies. We just were obsessed with the movies when we were little kids. It all really kind of comes full circle with us. We had been playing Dungeons & Dragons. And in 1987, that Star Wars role-playing game came out, and we were like the first ones to buy that, right? And we went on to play a 10-year campaign of Star Wars, the role-playing game by West End Games, and just became obsessed with it. And, we would buy all of the supplements, we'd read all the books. And that was really the basis of our knowledge and our love of Star Wars for many, many years, because that was kind of the only game in town during that period, right? During 1987, 88, 89, there wasn't much Star Wars stuff coming out. It was really just these role-playing game books, and we happened to be role-playing gamers. So that was really foundational for us, and we really became kind of do-it-yourself world builders in the Star Wars universe. So that was, it was really near and dear. I mean, my 3 favorite movies growing up were Return of the Jedi, Empire Strikes Back, and Star Wars. Right, like these, it was the top 3. So it's very near and dear to me.
Isn't it ironic that when people talk about the dark times, 'cause I think you and I are very similar in age, when people talk about the dark times, this is one of those examples. That role-playing game, that Star Wars role-playing game, very much kept the fire burning. I think that, and maybe the X-Wing PC game, among other little minor things like that. But for a lot of us, that kept the fire burning, and it sort of continued that blaze into where we are now.
I think you've got it exactly right, and in a way, it was kind of the perfect thing to come out at the perfect time because. Because role-playing is so do-it-yourself, and again, because it really encourages you to build your own worlds and kind of to self-imagine and kind of be part of the story, as it were. I think for that to come out at that particular time, and this tremendous design staff at West End Games to really they were given the keys to the kingdom to define what a lot of this stuff was in the movies, right? You think about like the Hammerhead from the original film becomes the Ithorian, right? They have to actually give names to these species and these individual characters and motivations and what they're all about. So it was a pretty incredible thing for that particular thing to be coming out at that time, where they kind of dried up on toys and a lot of other things. A lot of their licensed products had kind of gone away by that time, and they didn't really do much else until the early 90s. So in between, you're kind of building this culture of do-it-yourself Star Wars people. I know a lot of people came out of that culture, people like Pablo Hidalgo, who ended up working for West End Games himself and was a designer for them. So, and again, it's not surprising to be at this point that here we are, 30 years later, and he's now kind of sitting and working in story for the franchise, because that's kind of the perfect place to start.
Yeah, I think that guy's going to go places.
Yeah, I think he's really up and coming. Yeah. He's what an amazing guy. I had the pleasure of actually meeting him just a couple weeks ago at Lucasfilm. They were kind enough actually for this particular book to have us in and talk to the Lucasfilm staff about this Art and Arcana D&D book we just did, and Pablo was the one that facilitated and hosted that particular talk out there. That was a real highlight.
D&D. Yeah, he loves D&D.
No, yeah, but he's real deal. I mean, he's designed obviously role playing games, and this is part of his DNA, and part of a lot of our DNA that grew up, really kind of playing these really immersive kind of do it yourself games, and then taking those things to these other intellectual properties, whether it be Star Wars or D&D or beyond. So it was a pretty interesting way to start.
Absolutely, the world building concepts that you mentioned earlier, clearly Star Wars and Dungeons and Dragons are perfect examples of that. And Tolkien, of course, is probably the main one, I think, when you look at, creating a language and all of the things that he did. The man was a genius. But so is Lucas, and so is Gygax. And you have quite a background with Gary Gygax as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the way I got into this whole book business, I guess. So as I mentioned, so Sam and I both played D&D from when we were really young. And so the interest had been there since we were, very, very young kids. But it cut ahead, literally 30 years. I was in a master's program at the University of Chicago. And I was finishing up the program. I had to write a special project, and I decided to do a biographical project on Gary Gygax, this kind of mysterious figure that lived up the road in Lake Geneva. I'm from Chicago. Lake Geneva is about 70 miles north. It's a southern Wisconsin, little sleepy southern Wisconsin kind of fishing and resort town. And that's where the whole D&D phenomenon started. That's where Gary Gygax lived. And he was the one that co-founded and co-created this game, Dungeons and Dragons. And I was always curious about him. And so I somehow lighted on the idea of writing a biographical project about him, partly because I knew that living in this area here in the Midwest, that you have access to a lot of these people that were around during those days. Gary Gygax himself died in 2008, but a lot of these kind of all-stars and Hall of Famers of role-playing game history, they're still around, and you can go and see them at a convention and talk to these people. And so I came to this conclusion I could write this project, and that turned into a book. That actually turned into a book about a couple years later. Bloomsbury bought the book, and it was a biography about Gary Gygax called Empire of Imagination, Gary Gygax and the Birth of Dungeons and Dragons. And it did very well. It was a kind of a narrative nonfiction approach to telling Gary's whole story, which was this amazing kind of roll up your sleeves, classic American, bootstraps kind of story. It's an amazing story of how D&D all came about. So that was kind of my background with Gary, and I got to know his whole family as a result of doing this project. I talked to all of them. So that's kind of how I got into the book business, and it kind of connected to all of my passions around role-playing games.
Isn't that amazing? There's such the shared universe thing. I mean, Star Wars, of course, is more science fantasy than science fiction. But if you were to make a parallel, and we're definitely going to talk a lot about the book because, my goodness, it's a masterpiece. It's very much kind of broken the mold, I think, of how we're going to look at pop culture. But we'll get to that. What kind of comparisons would you say are there between Star Wars and Dungeons and Dragons? For people who, of course, we all are aware of Dungeons and Dragons, but there may be some people out there who might be a little bit intimidated by it, but they feel comfortable in the Star Wars universe, which is incredibly expansive in its own right. Where do you see the connections between the two?
Yeah, there's really quite a lot. So consider that these phenomena are happening roughly at the same time, right? Dungeons and Dragons officially comes out in 1974 as as a very homebrew game. So while that's a few years before Star Wars comes out, naturally, it's this was a game that was hand assembled by Gary and his family and partners in 1974. They printed an original 1,000 of these, what they call these brown boxes, which is this little kind of it's this little box that holds these 3 little rule booklets. Kind of digest-sized booklets. But what's notable about it is that when they're hitting their stride is around the same time. So D&D starts to become something that people are hearing about around 77, 78, 79. So these things are kind of happening, at least from a cultural standpoint, these things are kind of happening concurrently. Now, Star Wars is many, many times the success, the instant success that D&D is at this time. But you have a ton of overlap of people that are indulging in both these things, right? Star Wars, of course, is very broad brush. A lot of people are engaging in Star Wars, the films, and the toys, for that matter. Whereas D&D is a much smaller, more esoteric audience, but it's very safe to say just about anybody that's playing D&D is into Star Wars. Like that's a virtual 100% overlap right there. Why? Because these are people that are into fantasy, to science fiction, and to things like this. I mean, the very D&D culture grew out of people that were lovers of science fiction and fantasy, particularly pulp fantasy. So they were really into the same stuff, and it kind of has a lot of the same seeds that Star Wars had, I think.
Oh, I think so too. And there's again that great connection, that great love, and they both contain this notion of building upon where you are when you start out and getting stronger through different experiences, whether it's with dice or the Force, or it's all about the choices we make and the paths that we take. And I think it's really interesting to see those parallels between the two. Mm. It's empowering. It really is.
Oh gosh, yes. No, I mean, I think it's an amazing. I think kind of the nature of both of these movements are pretty incredible. And again, I think there's a lot of overlap. It was just a time when for whatever reason people got this idea that they could do it themselves. They could go ahead and dream big. They could come up with things, and they could bring other people into these amazing shared fantasy universes, whether it be George Lucas doing it via Star Wars or whether it be Gary Gygax doing it via this really strange esoteric table game called Dungeons and Dragons. But again, these were really foundational to these early cultures, and a lot of people that were engaging these things. Again, I think you see today that a lot of these people are kind of the masters of the information age, right? People that grew up playing D&D, people that grew up loving Star Wars. These are people that are now working at companies like Google or Lucasfilm or Pixar, or they're doing a number of different things. They might be doctors or lawyers or anything, but I think they've taken all that with them, and it's really created kind of a culture where it's chic to be geek, I guess you could say.
Ah, well said. Well said. You should be a writer. I like that.
Yeah, right.
So let's go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to talk more with Mike about Dungeons and Dragons. We're going to go specifically into the formation of this book and his growing up playing Dungeons & Dragons. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
This is Coffee with Kenobi. Oh, pass the cream, would you?
Thanks again to everybody for their awesome comments and feedback on our CWK pour-overs. Last week we did a very special tribute to Stan Lee, who of course had such a big impact on us as fans of comic books and popular culture. This week we changed gears because Thanksgiving is today. You're listening to this show on Thanksgiving. We also have a very special CWK pour-over available for you. And on this show, Tom, Corey, and myself talk about our Thanksgiving traditions. When is it too early to put up your Christmas decorations? Our thoughts on Black Friday and all kinds of good stuff. This is one of those episodes where we laugh quite a bit, and there's a little bit of a sample right now of this week's show of the silliness that ensues. Maybe I should apologize in advance. Here it is.
This week is a little bit special. We're celebrating Thanksgiving, so those of you chowing down some munchies and some food, feel free to pause and enjoy our conversation. But as we gather here at the table for Thanksgiving, let's introduce our first guest, is Dan Z.
Well, hello. I like that you said gathering around the table, and I don't have a voice today to be silly with or to impersonate because I've had a bit of a cold, and people listening to the show and Coffee with Kenobi probably noticed that. But I did bring, Corey and Tom, I did bring turkey with me because I was Thanksgiving. This is one of the turkeys that made.
Come on, you can do it.
It's one of the turkeys.
I want to hear this.
It's one of the turkeys that didn't join us at the dinner table.
Okay.
Because this one was special to us. I can't. It doesn't sound as good with a bad throat. There you go. Nothing but high quality entertainment. We have an absolute blast. It's because of our CWK Patreon family members like Ben Elkington, Rebecca Raven, Dennis Keithley, Terry Lee, Melinda Wolf, Wayne Booker, Aaron Harris, Chris Kavarka, Angela Sauce, Mediocre Jedi, Caroline Maselli, Tim Bungaroth, Chris Metz, LJ Souter, Thea Selby, Jeff Ellis, Daz Davies, Christian Dale, Jason Hall, Brian McKinney, Connie Shee, Mike Audette, Jared Cantor, BJ Smith, Eric Struthers, Nick Deco, and Mark Suter. Thank you so much to each and every one of you. And if you would like to be a part of this list or be able to get the chance to listen to our weekly CWK pour-over, all you need to do is go to www.patreon.com/coffeewithkenobi or go to the top of our webpage, coffeewithkenobi.com, and click on the Patreon link. For $5 or more a month, you get access to our CWK pour-over, as well as the opportunity to find t-shirts, coffee mugs, phone cases, and so much more. We are back, and we are here with Mike Witwer, the author of Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana, A Visual History. Before we get into the specifics of the book, how did you kind of foster a love of Dungeons & Dragons? I know you and your brother played, but where do you remember kind of that moment where you discovered the game and you both learned it? Obviously, you bought the player's handbook and things of that nature, but were there people in your neighborhoods that brought it to you, or was it through school, or how did that happen?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. We were some of our best friends kind of lived right around the corner in our neighborhood, and they had an older brother. And Sam had a chance to play with this. So this is like he's probably maybe a teenager at that point. This might, this older kid may have been like 12. Sam may have been like 7 or something like that, right? And he has a chance to play with this older kid because again this is the older brother of some of his best friends. And so he has a chance to play for a couple of years there or whatever. And at some point, and this is where I kind of jump into the picture. No, be mindful. So Sam is about 3 years older than me. Not about. He's almost exactly 3 years older than me.
Okay.
So this same older neighborhood kid at one point kind of burns out on the game and decides he wants to sell his books. So I remember very distinctly going over with Sam and my dad to their house. And for my brother's birthday, he wanted to buy this kid's advanced Dungeons and Dragons books. It was this huge stack of like late 70s and early 80s D&D books. And I remember being there with him, and I remember this kid negotiating with my dad, and he ended up buying these books. And we took them home. And so at this point, I bet you Sam is like 10-ish, maybe, and I'm probably 7, give or take. And so keep in mind, so this is D&D in the 80s, so there's not that many people to play with, right? This is still not like it was a pretty big time for D&D, but it's not like a super mainstream game. It never really was up until kind of now.
Sure.
So I don't think he had that many people to play with. So me and my best friend became his guinea pigs. So me and my friend Nick became these guinea pigs that would play with Sam. Sam was the dungeon master, and he would run us through these modules that he had bought. And we were playing original AD&D rules. And and we were like little kids, so we were really not ready to be playing Dungeons and Dragons. This is a game that, when you're that young, your inclination is to be like really reckless and kind of violent and stupid and crazy, right? Because you're kind of too young to handle it. And I remember Sam getting really frustrated with us, and he would make us pay for these things, right? He would like send level 9 monsters after us to take care of us because we were being irresponsible. So that's the kind of thing that would happen in those days. But yeah, we played early on and we loved it. We loved the game. It was such an immersive thing, even from the very beginning. That was kind of how we got into it.
Interesting. Do you remember? And this is coming from a guy who I've played off and on throughout my life, but I don't feel like I ever really learned how to play until about a year ago. So in fact, we're working on now. We're actually playing tomorrow night. There are 5 of us, 5 educators, and we get to get together once a month at one of the other teachers' houses, and we play. Did you have any challenges when you were learning to play this game, and where did you find your learning curve?
So it was pretty organic with me because when we started, we had no idea what we were doing. So Sam would basically take care of the mechanics. I mean, when you're like 7, you're like kind of barely reading and stuff, let alone trying to figure out. I guess this is pre-Thaco, but like how these hit tables work. So we weren't doing the mechanics. We were just declaring actions. Basically, we were playing a narrative game of D&D, and Sam would go ahead and take care of that. And Sam really grew a love for kind of understanding these rules. I mean, he would really engage with these things and really try to figure them out and make sure that he understood how the mechanics of these games worked. He over time, we've become probably more free-form type players, as most role-playing games have gotten to be kind of more of a narrative level. But in those days, Sam would really engage in those mechanics and be able to kind of guide us through all of it, letting us just really kind of play as role players. That is to say, not doing the mechanics, but just declaring our actions and seeing how and he would take care of resolution.
Oh, wow. So basically, nice. And so basically he was your mentor, which is great. So now you get this amazing opportunity to write a book with your brother and 2 other very distinguished authors about this game that you've loved for so long. And this incredible book has over 700 pieces of artwork. They're absolutely stunning. And boy, is there a lot of nostalgia there. But this book is so much more than this beautiful piece of art. It's so much more than a coffee table book. It's literally and figuratively a walk through the history of the game and its evolution. So if you're a fan of art or prose, this book has got everything that you need. So how did this epic design come to be?
Well, thank you for those comments. It was a labor of love. This book was in every possible way a huge labor of love for all of us, and we're all very, very connected to this game. So how it came to be was Kyle Newman, who many Star Wars people would certainly know from his work on Smuggler's Gambit. He does those great radio plays for Celebration, a lot of other things, and of course, he was the director of Fanboys in 2009.
Yes.
So Kyle knew my brother, Sam, and he had somehow come across Empire of Imagination, my first book about Gary Gygax, and he loved it. He thought it was great. He loved the way I kind of very cinematically told this story. Again, it's a narrative nonfiction approach, so it's very cinematic in its approach. It doesn't read like traditional nonfiction. It almost reads more like fiction. Or like a movie or something like that.
Right.
So
it's quite engaging, by the way. I absolutely love, as a background with literature, I love the metacognitive process, and I like how you constructed that, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
For sure.
So Kyle really enjoyed that. As a filmmaker, I think it really resonated with him. So he called me, I think around the May of 2016. I had never met Kyle, but I think we were Facebook friends and we kind of knew of each other through my brother. And he got a hold of me and had been looking around and said, hey, I love your book, love Empire of Imagination. Where's the D&D art book? And, and I was like, well, it's funny. And I was aware there had been a couple D&D art books over time, but like long time ago in the TSR days, in the 80s and the early 90s, they had put out a couple of really kind of lousy art books. And again, I never really engaged in that part of the narrative, really, right? I was more interested in the hard history and Gary Gygax's history. But he said, where's the art book? And I said, well, surely they've done something, right? So I actually remember going to, but he was very interested in this, and he said, I don't think there's an art book, and I think we should look at, making this. So I said, well, let me look into it a little bit. I remember going to the bookstore and looking around, and he was exactly right. I was looking at the shelves. I remember seeing there was the art of Assassin's Creed. There was the art of Magic Zendikar. There was the art of DC Comics. There was all these different DC encyclopedias, Marvel encyclopedias, various art of Star Wars, et cetera, et cetera. And there was no art of D&D. And it really did seem odd. And I was like, wow, I think he's onto something here. So I got back to him and like, yeah, I think you're onto something here. We should look at this. So what happened from there is we decided like, yeah, we're going to team up and try to make this thing. Let's make the art book. This is the book we want. And so me having studied this on a pretty deep level, having written another book or whatever, the first thing I did was I said, well, one thing I know about the art is that the original art, and one thing Kyle was really passionate about is that he really wanted to get a lot of the native art, the art that was unencumbered by trade dress and text bubbles on the back, right? He wanted to see what this original art looked like. The problem was that this stuff has been dispersed to the four winds for many, many years, 30 years. Sure. Frankly, a lot of the early stuff wasn't so great that anyone decided to keep it. It was just kind of, some of it was thrown away, or it entered private collections many, many, many years ago. And I knew that. So the first thing I did is I called my really good friend and colleague, John Peterson, who really is kind of the preeminent D&D scholar out there. And he also happens to be a collector. And a pretty prominent collector at that. And so we knew that getting some pretty good connection to the collector community would be really, really key, because we wouldn't be able to get a lot of the stuff we wanted if we were going to do such a book. And then the next thing we did is we said, well, we got to bring in Sam to this project. And as and Kyle tells me that I guess Sam reached out to him, was like, hey, you're doing this book with my brother. Hey, what about me? So, Sam's the one that brought me into this in the first place. So we brought in Sam, who's just such a great storyteller and has such a great experiential take on this game. I mean, he was always the dungeon master. He really understands storytelling in this particular way. So this became the team that we built. It was Kyle and myself and John Peterson and Sam. And we embarked on this thing. We wrote up a proposal, and it was really serendipitous the way this whole thing worked from here. I mean, again, we could have never planned this, but what ended up happening was we started doing some feelers out, seeing what we thought we might be able to gather from the collector community, et cetera, et cetera. And, we knew enough to think, we could make a book that's pretty good here. I think we think we can find, some pretty meaningful pieces and put some pristine product in there and, tell an interesting story as far as an art book goes. What ended up happening was I went to one of my good friends at Wizards of the Coast, who's the producer of D&D these days, Chris Perkins. And Chris Perkins is the head of story over there. And I had gotten to know Chris because Chris loved Empire of Imagination as well, and we had a chance to talk about that or whatever. So I approached him and said, "Hey, do you think Wizards would be interested in doing like a comprehensive art book type of thing?" And he said, "Well, I mean, and I showed him this proposal that we had written, and he said, well, maybe, I don't know. Let me hook you up with who could make that call." Mm. And it was their head of publishing, a woman named Liz Shue. She was just wonderful. She's awesome. And Liz got back to me and said, "Hey, we love this proposal. We're not really in the business of doing these art books right now. We're really focused on our game books right now. But it just so happens that like last week, we got a call from Penguin Random House who was interested in doing a project together, presumably something like this." Wow. So she hooked us up with 10 Speed Press specifically. That's the imprint we're talking about. And literally in the next week or two, we were on the phone with them, and we're all on the same page immediately about getting something going. I mean, it was an incredibly smooth process. And from there, what ends up happening, and I promise I'll abridge the story at that point, we come to the conclusion that, we're going to get one chance to do something akin to not just an art book, but a complete visual history. We decide that well, an art book is all fair and good. How do you curate the art? How do you make something that's really meaningful? And we decided that actually let's tell a story through visuals, but it doesn't have to be just art. We know we can find some great art, but what about product? What about advertising? What about rare photographs and draft memos and original sketches by Gary Gygax and others? We had access to a lot of that stuff. So we decided to tell a much broader story and really decided to tell the entire story of Dungeons and Dragons as told through its visuals versus just an art book. And so that's kind of where we landed, and that's what we embarked on.
Wow. See, the great thing about this conversation is that you are a storyteller, and the process of this book is a story into and of itself, which I think is fascinating because there's real passion there, and I think that carries through in this wonderful book. So let's go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we're going to look much, much more closely at the book and talk more with Mike Witwer about some Star Wars as well. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
Greetings. This is Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi.
Well, gentlemen, apparently the word on the street is that guys can be hard to shop for. But the good news, and you can pass this along to your significant other, Harry's is the perfect gift. And what I love about this is that I know it's difficult to find the right holiday gift. It can be almost impossible to find something for someone like me. I mean, I've pretty much got everything Star Wars I could ever need. But there are other things that add to my Christmas, and Harry's Razors is one of those things. I don't really need another wallet or more socks, and neither do you most likely. Harry's is an awesome thing for you to have for Christmas. You can personalize your razor to make it feel special. Choose a color that's right for the person in your life. Now with limited edition holiday handles, and they are gorgeous. I've seen them. They look amazing. You can also get a personal engraving option, which is really, really nice. I'm actually thinking about getting another one that kind of looks like it's got a red Christmas vibe. I thought it'd be fun to put CWK in it, so I'm still thinking about that. And these come ready to gift. The sets come in a handsome gift box, and the gift sets start at just $10. We're also talking about a 100% quality guarantee. If you don't like it, return it, and it's quick and easy, plus hassle-free. Nothing wrong with that. As a special offer for fans of the show, we've partnered with Harry's to give you $5 off any shave set, including our limited edition holiday sets, when you go to harrys.com/CWK family. Plus, you get free shipping. This offer is for new and returning customers and is only available for the holidays. Each Harry's shaving set comes with an ergonomic weighted handle with an option to engrave, German-engineered 5-blade cartridges that provide a close, comfortable shave, rich, lathering shave gel which smells amazing, a travel blade cover to protect your blades, and a handsome holiday gift box. Or just want something for yourself? Redeem your trial offer at Harry's today to experience the quality of shave before committing. Here is what you need to listen to. Get your holiday shopping done early. Free shipping ends on December 12th, so act now. Go to harrys.com/CWK family to get a $5 off a shave set while supplies last. That's harrys.com/CWK family. While you are doing your holiday shopping, this is a great time to actually go to our TeePublic Coffee with Kenobi store. We have some amazing sales going on right now. In fact, from November 21st to November 24th, it is a Black Friday sale. And if you go there, you'll see a lot of great things. In fact, most of this stuff is going to be up to 30% off. All your classic t-shirts are just $14. These shirts are awesome. I love my orange Coffee with Kenobi shirt. The challenge on the store, by the way, is when you go to it, it doesn't default to the orange for some reason. We've been trying to get that to change, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. But in the meantime, the orange option is there. So you click on that shirt, click on the color you want, and you are all set. They're also really comfortable hoodies. We're going to put our Christmas with Kenobi logo back up. I still wear that Christmas with Kenobi hoodie all the time. I love that thing. Well, I shouldn't say all the time. I should say I wear it during the holiday season, and this is the Christmas season now with Thanksgiving being here, and with this Black Friday sale, this is the way to go. We also have Coffee with Kenobi mugs that you can purchase. They have travel ones as well. Be sure to go to our website, coffeewithkenobi.com. There is a banner there for shirts and coffee mugs, and that will take you to all the other things in our store. There are also some other Star Wars designs there that are not designed by Corey Clever, awesome award-winning designer, but there's still some great Coffee with Kenobi related things because they are Star Wars related. So be sure to go to our TeePublic store right now for the Black Friday sale where you can get so many things up to 30% off. We are back, and I wanted to ask you, Mike, without revealing too much about who wrote what, I've been listening to a lot of your interviews It's very, very challenging, by the way, to come up with questions that you haven't already fielded hundreds and hundreds of times. So I appreciate this so much. When you're creating this book and the collaborative process, without revealing who wrote what, of course, how did you all decide sort of how to make that happen? Was it shared documents with one another? Did you say, I want to take this era? How did you approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, right. So this book was a true collaboration, right? And this is just not the same book if all four of us are not doing exactly what we're doing, and all playing different roles in our own way.
Absolutely.
But to answer your question, the core, one thing that we knew we needed if we were going to do a really good visual history, which again was a really challenging process to come up with, to figure out that, how do you tell the complete history of D&D, kind of going from earliest to latest in a one direction, the arrow of time only moves in one direction. It was surprisingly challenging to actually figure out how to do that. And I'll point you to a lot of other art of and visual history books out there. And what you'll see is that a lot of these books will do things by section. So, for example, to make it akin to what our book could have been, here's a section on maps. Here's a section on monsters. Here's a section on characters, or whatever it might be. That's one way you could do it, and it wouldn't be a wrong way to do it. It actually makes it a lot easier, right? It's when you're trying to tell a true narrative and tell it through visuals is where you realize that you've got a much bigger challenge in terms of how to kind of make that whole story make sense. So what we did is we actually cut up basically the 4 decades into roughly 10-year periods. And we worked with a spine that John Peterson had, actually kind of a timeline that he had worked on with Wizards originally. And so we decided that we would just blow that out as just a core spine. So what we wanted to do is try to get maybe 20,000 words on paper that had this kind of core spine about what are the key moments in D&D history we really need to hit, and what are those core products. We knew that would at least bring us somewhere, because it would help us guide how to attach imagery to that spine. Mm-hmm. And that would bring us in other directions. So that was really where we started. Is we kind of cut it up into like 4 decades, and we all wrote an initial draft of those pieces, and then we all kind of traded them and started revising each other's stuff. And then we of course had a bunch of call out sections. You having seen the book, you'll know there's like 8 different types of devices we use to tell this story. One is that core narrative that I'm talking about, that spine. But then there's there are several different ways we tell the story. We have something called sundry lore, right, where we have these kind of capsules where we try to cover, for example, like the whole computer game movement in over a few pages, or all of Dragon Magazine over a few pages, because those things were really, to have to keep coming back to them would have been kind of problematic when it came to the narrative. So we did these call outs where we could kind of attach those at appropriate places. So that was one of the ways we did it. But I mean, again, it was an incredible collaboration, and this thing really evolved a whole lot over time. And we really didn't know what we were getting into when we first started. And this book really, at the end of the day, came out in a way that I don't think we ever could have anticipated, and much better than we could have anticipated.
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, it sounds like it almost kind of took on a life of its own too, because it was an extremely unique collaborative process that what you're talking about doing, which I think is pretty impressive in its own right. But I'm curious, as obviously you're a student of this game, did the creation of this book change the way you look at Dungeons and Dragons and how you play the game?
Yeah, yeah. Now that you mentioned it, it totally does. And I'll go a step further and say that one thing I hope this book does for the larger market is that it actually enriches the game for others too. I think the more you understand about the history, not just the visuals, but the history itself, it adds a different level of richness to this game. I'll give you an example. If you play The Curse of Strahd today, which is a 5th edition, adaptation of kind of Ravenloft, really kind of a blown out mega module that's based on the original Ravenloft. But knowing that has history that goes back to 1983, and there's been lots of incarnations of Strahd, or there's been lots of incarnations of Acerak, the demi-lich who lives in the Tomb of Horrors, right? Knowing that there's a lot of history and provenance to those things, I think that's one thing that really enriches the game if you play today, because of course they harken back to a lot of these intellectual properties that they created in the 70s and 80s. So that's one area that I think that makes it really fun. But I will tell you, I see the game completely differently today. When I think about all the things they were trying to do over time to make the game accessible, to indoctrinate new and younger players into the game, it was a really hard game to bring people into because it was so hard to explain to people.
Yes.
And this was a problem they had all the way up till very recently. With the advent of, with the advent of live streaming games. This is the first time in history, really, where people can, in 5 minutes on YouTube, figure out how to play Dungeons and Dragons really easily. Before that, they were coming up with new basic sets and starter kits and all kinds of different things that were trying to get people to understand this game at kind of a more elementary level. But to answer your question, I think this game has freed me as a player more than ever because I think I understand the roots of it better. I think I understand what Gary Gygax's original intention was when it comes to the game. He hated rules lawyers is what he called them. The rules are there to serve the game. And what this is really about is this great narrative experience you have with your friends where you get to do this kind of shared storytelling experience, but it's guided by very particular mechanics. So, while you might have this sort of shared storytelling experience that you can't control everything that happens, right? That is ultimately up to hopefully a fair dungeon master and right. The dice. The dice will determine the resolution of whether these things work or not. And so it's kind of freed me as a player. The more I understand about, the holistic history of the game, what the original intent was. And I think I enjoy it now more than ever.
That's cool. That's really cool. And what you're mentioning is very much the mantra of what I understand the creators of the 5th edition were very much about. They know that the rules can be daunting, but they really want it to be about the story and about the players and creating this world together. And it seems like that is definitely happening.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, Dan, because that is the peanut butter and jelly, right? If the peanut butter is the live streaming games, let's say the Critical Roles of the world, right? The other part is the 5th edition rules. This has been the other broken barrier to entry. They've figured out a rule set that is built in such a way that it's accessible. You can kind of ramp up its complexity or ramp it down depending on what you want to do. Mm-hmm. They've really studied all of the original, all the other rule sets, and they've brought this tremendous perspective to it. The current designers of the game, and they of course did the largest game test in role playing game history with D&D Next, and all of those things have combined to make what is probably the most elegant rule set the game has had, or at least let's just say it's the right rule set for now.
Right,
and you pair on top of that some of these external factors like live streaming games and some other things. And a lot of other things, by the way. That's not to ignore some of the external popularity of the game based on things like Stranger Things or the fact that there's a lot of very important people right now that grew up on D&D and love it. People like Jon Favreau, who of course is directing Star Wars live action show. He basically, you can find interviews of him saying, I learned just to do my storytelling through D&D. People like, Steve Colbert talk about, how much they love the game. There's many, many examples of people sitting on top of entertainment and technology and whatnot that talked about how formative this game was. So I think a confluence of all these factors has made this this game's having a moment. And hopefully it's a very long one.
This is the 5th edition has become very much a renaissance. The books themselves are gorgeous. And then you put art and Arcana into that mix. And you've got like this wonderful companion to the greatest role-playing game that's ever been made. And there's so much history there, as we talked about. My goodness, we could talk for hours and not scratch the surface of all the incarnations of Dungeons and Dragons and different things that have happened. I want to talk about the cartoon series from the 80s.
Well, of course, he doesn't want to talk about the cartoon series. So it's funny. So my earliest memories are watching the cartoon series, right? Oh, yeah. I loved the cartoon series. And that was actually, it's a great point because that was probably the most visible incarnation of Dungeons and Dragons at that time, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the 80s. This is the height of the D&D fad. So consider that, this is such an interesting story for many, many reasons, just to give some context around it. So the cartoon series runs from 1983 to 1985. It runs for, I think, 27 episodes. That basically equates to, I think, roughly 3 cartoon seasons or 2.5, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And it airs on CBS, and I'll get back to that in a second because I think there's some interesting context around that too. So, but the cartoon series, what are they trying to do at TSR? And TSR, of course, is the maker of D&D in those days. So they're trying to indoctrinate younger players, and they're trying to figure out a way to get younger players familiar and comfortable with the D&D IP and some of the concepts of the game. And so this is around the time of the Red Box, the Red Box, which is the Menser Basic set that comes out in 1983, and that's a big success. Sure. Matter of fact, the cover of our book, of course, is the same cover they used for that Red Box. That's right. Brilliant Larry Elmore piece with the dragon. But so the cartoon series is really interesting. So consider that this is kind of during the Satanic Panic era. Right. What we in the industry anyway call it the Satanic Panic era. Right. So there's a lot of people worried about the game during this period.
When you rhyme it, it's less scary.
I mean, consider that this thing showed up in ET a year before.
That's right.
That cartoon series came out. Right. And meanwhile, there's all kinds of different things happening around the game, and there's a lot of controversy around it. Like a year before that, have you ever seen the movie Mazes and Monsters by chance?
Oh, yeah.
So that was based on a book by Rona Jaffe that turned into a made-for-TV movie, also on CBS, by the way, starring a young Tom Hanks. And it was a movie about essentially how this D&D is a game that blurs the lines between fantasy and reality, and it's potentially psychologically dangerous. That's kind of that's the whole idea around this CBS movie, Mazes and Monsters. So it shows up in ET. Then they have the cartoon series again, also on CBS. Amazingly, in 1985, so the same year that the cartoon series is ending, CBS also airs 60 Minutes. And there's this very famous 60 Minutes segment with Ed Bradley where D&D is vilified by a group called Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, BADD. And again, this is a group that is convinced that this game is psychologically dangerous and even is in cahoots with occult activities, including kind of Satan worship. That was this stigma the game got. So the cartoon series exists in this really interesting period of time in D&D history for a lot of reasons. But again, it was also like the most visible thing that the most mainstream thing that D&D was doing at the time.
Well, and then you've got, Venger and, which who knows what people thought about that. But that game very much was almost like the thing that gave me permission, in my mind to like, okay, this is cool. It's a cartoon, so it's got to be cool, right?
Right.
And, eating your cereal and watching Dungeons and Dragons, and that very much catapulted me into buying that Red Box that you mentioned and trying to learn how to play that game. And some of those things have carried over. I know, who doesn't think about having a light bow like that awesome ranger does, and which to me, I don't think there is anything like that in the game. Now, is there?
No. So I mean, it was such a peculiar series because Hank the Ranger has got this bow that fires like lightning bolts. I guess. I mean, there are some magical items that do some things kind of akin to that, I guess. But what was so interesting about it, and my colleague and co-author Kyle Newman talks about this a lot. Actually, this idea that for some reason, at the time, it seemed for some reason that the D&D property, as it would be adapted to a cartoon or any kind of film, because again, at the same time, they actually had a Beverly Hills presence, did TSR, and Gary Gygax had moved out there, and he was like working on a live action film as well while he was out there with James Goldman and some other people. And in both cases, both this draft film that never got made, there's a script that we've had a chance to see, and then the cartoon series. For some reason, they decided that the only way to explain D&D to people was to have this kind of notion of like kids entering this other world, right? Like you would enter this other dimension and become these characters. Whereas, of course, looking back on it, it's like, D&D could have just rested on some of its in-world fantasy IP and been fine, right? Like they could have just made a movie about Greyhawk or a little bit later Dragonlance, which of course they did later. But these were perfectly viable fantasy worlds. They didn't have to introduce them like, oh, you're a kid that goes on a roller coaster and then you fall into this realm, and then all of a sudden now you're a ranger and you have these magical weapons. That seemed to be the only way that they could figure out how to adapt this notion of playing a character that's not yourself into kind of like a narrative intellectual property. I don't know how well it ever really took.
Well, I know I sure loved it. And then look at something like Tiamat. I mean, that character, was that creature created for the cartoon, or was it Tiamat already in the books?
No, Tiamat was already in the books. Tiamat pre-existed the cartoon.
So.
But to your point, it was important that they were bringing these characters into the cartoon series, right? Consider that the Beholder. I think the Beholder makes an appearance in the first or second episode.
Mm-hmm.
It's an episode I think called "Eye of the Beholder," is my recollection. So they're bringing D&D monsters into the fold. They're bringing orcs and things like that. And actually, interesting Star Wars reference, given that we're on Coffee with Kenobi.
Yes.
So the orcs, the orcs from the Monster Manual in 1977 are these kind of pig-faced, creatures, and they kind of recreated those for the cartoon series. But those orcs, I mean, Gamorrean guards are basically 1977 orcs. I mean, if you look at Gamorrean guards, they are styled exactly after how D&D had defined orcs and how they had kind of portrayed them also in the cartoon series. So again, I think people in that space, and I'm not suggesting Lucas was necessarily directly inspired by it, but he's clearly working with other creatives that are seeing this stuff, right? There's an overlap of culture at this time. And so there's no doubt that they're probably borrowing some pieces from each other.
Well, isn't it fascinating that a lot of these fantasy things we talked about inspire Gygax, and then Dungeons and Dragons inspires a whole generation of storytellers? It's just very much circular, which is great. I think there's something to this collective consciousness we have and this love of stories and storytelling. So let's go ahead and take one last break. When we come back, I'm going to talk with Michael about Dungeons and Dragons in the classroom. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
Coffee, tea, or me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's Coffee with Kenobi.
I mentioned at the top of the show, MEI and Mouse Fan Travel. Our school is actually... MEI and Mouse Fan Travel is the absolute way to go if you are planning a Disney World or Disneyland vacation. They have signature service and expert advice to help clients maximize their vacation time and dollar. They also help your family enjoy everything the Disney theme parks and cruise lines have to offer. And I mean, there is a lot of stuff there. Whether you're a first timer or you've been there many, many, many times, you know Disney is always evolving and changing, and Mouse Fan Travel is on top of that. They help you plan every detail, and they share invaluable tips with you. Be sure to go to www.mousefantravel.com today and let them know Coffee with Kenobi sent you. One Nation Coffee is the official brew of Coffee with Kenobi. I start my morning every day with One Nation Coffee because it is the absolute best. You can start your coffee subscription so you never miss out on the best coffee in the galaxy by going to www.onenationcoffee.com today. Plus, enter the code Kenobi10 to set up a coffee subscription and save 10% off your first order. We're back, and I want to talk with Mike about Dungeons & Dragons and the applications in the classroom, but before we get to that, we do need to talk about that galaxy far, far away. Let's look a little more closely, too, at some of these Star Wars connections to Dungeons & Dragons, because there are more than people might think.
Yeah, I mean, they're all over the place. And as a matter of fact, even with regard to how this book was built, Art and Arcana, there was just Star Wars connections everywhere you looked. I mean, I'll give you one example. So one thing the author team and I talk about a lot is this notion that this book was as much archaeology as it was anything else. I mean, namely because a lot of this original art and material we were trying to find, it just didn't exist anywhere. You couldn't find it. You can't Google it. It's in private collections and it's gone, right? It's in like that big warehouse at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? But one of the areas that was pretty cool as we were looking for, one of the things that was high on our list were these original Advanced Dungeons and Dragons wraparound paintings. These are these wraparound cover paintings that went around the spine of these original AD&D books. And they'd never been published in their native form before. They always had, trade dress on them, the spine, of course, and, text bubbles on the back. So we really wanted to find these. And we were looking around, and we saw through one of these collector sites that a fellow named Dave Mandel had at one point bought the Monster Manual painting. The Monster Manual was the first of those wraparound covers, and it's a particularly iconic piece. So we started looking around, and we realized that there was a fellow named Dave Mandel that was an art collector that wrote a Ralph McQuarrie book.
Oh, wow.
Not terribly long ago. Actually, and it's that tremendous Ralph McQuarrie book, those huge, I think they're by Abrams.
Yes.
He's one of the co-authors on that. So we looked a little bit deeper, and this is the same Dave Mandel who's the showrunner of Veep. And he was the one that wrote the Bizarro Jerry and Kramer episode of Seinfeld once upon a time. Yeah, it's the same Dave Mandel.
Wow.
So he's a huge Star Wars guy. He's a collector, and he's the one that we thought, I think this is the person that has the monster manual. We kind of were digging on this. And so, it turns out, Kyle was, I think, Facebook friends with him. And he knows a lot of people. I mean, he lives in Hollywood. He's a director. He knows a lot of people out there. And he was able to get a hold of Dave and get these, not only this incredible piece, but a bunch of other incredible pieces from this guy. But again, it was just one more interesting kind of Star Wars type connection. In this particular case, it was a person that was a big collector of largely Star Wars art, right? Ralph McQuarrie, concept art, that type of thing.
Sure.
And he also collects D&D art, no surprise. So, it was connections like that made this a really rewarding process to be able to find things like that and to be able to publish them for the first time. That was really pretty cool.
I was going to say, it really enriches sort of the D&D palette, seeing that connection to Star Wars as well. Because I imagine it was pretty tricky hunting down some of this original work, especially when not everyone is constantly posting their most prized possessions online.
Well, that's exactly right. Is this stuff was pretty much off the radar, and there were no captures of a lot of this stuff. So we went on a 2-year mission to really get perfect captures of this stuff, whether it be with our own cameras or license them for somebody else that would take them for us. But I mean, again, we covered a lot of ground. A lot of these original paintings were in Sydney, Australia, and Hong Kong. I mean, really just not even on the continent anymore, let alone kind of around. So it was an incredible archaeology process, and we were able to find some really pretty remarkable things. Early drafts. I'll give you one example. Is we found the first tournament draft of Tomb of Horrors, which is kind of one of the most famous modules of all time.
Oh, yeah.
We found a 1975 tournament version of that, the only known copy that we're aware of anyway.
Wow.
And this was something that we were able to really learn a lot from, something that had never been seen before, and be able to publish some of those images. Stuff like that was pretty cool, to say nothing of the fact when you learn the story behind the story. In this particular case, that a lot of these early artists were like 14-year-olds that were local kids that Gary Gygax would, pay literally a couple bucks to do these drawings for them. Like, it was things like that really provided a whole new context around this, around D&D, and really truly how homebrew this game really was.
As a rule, of course, it's fun. Of course, it's engaging. It is almost like as my wife says, well, Dan, this is your poker night, playing Dungeons and Dragons. So that's exactly right. That's exactly what it is. You get together with your friends and you have a great time, but you're also doing something very interesting that I think most games don't bring to the table. And there's a lot of critical thinking. There's a lot of strategy. There's a lot of engagement. There's a lot of, collaborative efforts. And there are different personality challenges you have to overcome within your characters. And I think that's important. And as a high school educator, I personally believe that engagement and critical thinking are very much key components of getting students to learn and to want to learn and to find that passion. Mm-hmm. Now, for you, Mike, how does Dungeons and Dragons promote that?
Well, gosh, I think I kind of learned to tell stories and to think in the way I think anyway because of Dungeons and Dragons. Again, I don't have a lot of context because, of course, I grew up with it, so I don't know what the a life without Dungeons and Dragons looks like. I don't know what it would have been like otherwise. But I would say that there's enough evidence at this point with my own life and within the life of a lot of creatives that I know and people that have talked about it and I've seen that suggests that this was a really formative thing. This was very different than just sitting there and reading a book. This was something that made you want to sit and imagine much bigger things. You wanted to sit and you wanted to draw your character. You wanted to write pages and pages about your character's backstory. You wanted to draw maps and draw dungeons. So again, I mentioned it earlier, this notion of do-it-yourself fantasy, do-it-yourself world building. I don't think we can underestimate how important or influential that was to a budding group of, take me out of the equation entirely, but to a budding group of creatives that were people that were working at mainframe computers at a lot of the major universities. The game, a lot of the early adopters happened to be college kids. And a lot of these college kids were working at the mainframes at Stanford, University of Illinois, and MIT and other places. And it was no wonder that a lot of these early computer incarnations of kind of role-playing games started coming out, because people were trying to recreate a role-playing game experience via a computer structure. So they had these, these MUDs, these multi-user dungeons very early in the late 70s, where people were basically trying to create games like role-playing games. People like George R.R. Martin, kind of cut their teeth playing role-playing games. So again, there was this budding group of creatives that I think happened to be early adopters to this game. And they really kind of went on. And a lot of these people are, again, very influential today. They're running companies and they're doing some pretty important things. So again, I even taking myself out of it, I think there's a lot of, evidence that this game is really, really good for your imagination, for your intellect and beyond.
And it's exciting too, because students, there are all kinds of studies out there that I've been looking at, especially recently, where there are students who are struggling readers, or they just don't find merit in it. And then you introduce them to Dungeons and Dragons, and you've got these beautiful 5th edition books, and they want to find answers. They want to find ways to increase their storytelling, their characters, and sort of how things work. And that is like lighting a pilot light inside students that can cause a big impact on their future academic success.
That's a huge point, Dan, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I know a lot of educators are starting to try to use these concepts in the classroom, or have been for a while now, getting people to come out of their shell, for example.
That's right.
Making a safe environment where you can really stretch parts of your own personality. And of course, this is showing up in a lot of ways. I know a lot of speech therapists are using Dungeons and Dragons to help people, again, express themselves in a different way, or to have a safe environment by which to kind of communicate differently. Again, the reading and writing and math part, that's always been baked into D&D. And in fact, you can't really you can't learn these rules without really spending a lot of time kind of going over a lot of these kind of, really kind of engaging in the math element of the whole thing, figuring out these tables, figuring out all kinds of things. And of course, you have to read this stuff, cover to cover. I don't know if you have to. Again, there's a lot of newer players that, again, I would like to think that they can enter the game without feeling like they have to read all the books, right? That's, I think, one reason why the game is really taking off, is that they're trying to get people out of, you don't have to know everything to play a game of D&D. You can let your DM do that for a while until you catch on. But I think you're seeing it show up, big time in academia right now. And it's funny, because they've been trying, D&D as a game has been trying to get into classrooms since at least around 1980. There's an ad in our book that we put in there that's, add dragons to your classroom or something along those lines.
That's right. I love that.
Yeah. Do you see that? Yeah. And that's like an ad from like 1980-ish. And, even at the time, I think TSR was sitting there saying, how do we get this game? We see all these great benefits in this game. How do we get educators to use this? And of course, that was exactly at the time of that satanic panic I talked about, where the game was really getting a bad rap. And I think that was really what killed it at that time. Cut ahead 10, 15 years later, they were still trying to use all kinds of different they were still trying to, find a way to get this game in the classroom. And it never quite took, for a lot of different interesting reasons. Sometimes there's market pressures and other things. But I think now the game has such a big I think it's a fairly mainstream game at this point. It has a huge, player base. And I think there's a lot of people that understand this as a really effective way to engage people in a way that they otherwise couldn't, finding new dimensions of personalities and whatnot.
Oh, I agree. And that you keep mentioning finding a safe area, which is exactly what it is. Tom Gross, our CWK newsman, is who's really brought me back in this game into the fold. And he's been showing me a lot of great stuff about the classroom. And he has some game clubs that meet after school at the school where we teach that are doing just that. And it's exciting. And it's also very exciting to talk to you, Mike. This book, Dungeons and Dragons, Art and Arcana of Visual History, is a remarkable book. And this is not a sponsored podcast. This is just the real deal. It's fantastic. If you are interested in popular culture and storytelling and more of how this game works, this is absolutely the book for you. So be sure to go to our webpage. You can click on the Amazon link to buy it, or you could go through our show notes as well. But in the meantime, Mike, before we let you go, I got to ask you just one more thing about Star Wars. For you, I won't ask you to rank all the movies because that's sort of a pedantic thing anyway. But how do you feel the Disney property is taking the recent Star Wars films?
I think Disney is a tremendous steward of the Star Wars brand. I mean, I think, frankly, I don't think Lucas would have sold it to a group that he didn't trust to kind of take this to the next level. And Disney, creates entertainment just about as, better than anybody. I mean, you look at what they're doing with Star Wars, look at what they're doing with Marvel. They're just an incredible brand that knows how to create incredible entertainment. And that goes throughout their whole organization to Pixar and Disney Animation and beyond. I mean, it's a pretty incredible group of people to kind of have control of this right now. And again, I think they're doing an incredible job. I think the same way that D&D is making has found a way to make their game super accessible. I think Disney is thinking about a lot of those same things. I think they've opened up new dimensions of this Star Wars universe, and they've invited everybody to come. And I think that's probably the most exciting thing right now is to see how the universe is continually expanding, and there's a lot of new fans to this franchise. So it's pretty exciting.
Mike, it has been an absolute pleasure having you as a guest on Coffee with Kenobi. You are certainly welcome back for a cup anytime, my friend. Where can people reach out if they want to continue the conversation with you or ask you anything about Star Wars or Dungeons and Dragons?
Oh, sure. So you can find me at Twitter at Mike Witwer on Twitter. Or you can always find me at my website for my previous book, empireofimagination.com, where there's a contact me section, all that stuff, if you ever wanted to reach out or send me an email or whatever. But yeah, and of course, I'm always happy to talk Star Wars, my first love. Always happy to talk D&D, also my first love. And again, I mean, I'm just really, first of all, I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm just really proud of this book and my co-authors that put this together, because again, this thing for us was a huge labor of love, and I think it shows up in the product. I like to believe it shows up in this product, this 450-page mammoth, kind of blunt weapon. 5
pounds.
It's pretty serious, but again, I mean, the things we found, I just don't think we ever in a million years thought we'd be able to find the things we did, and I think we've told a story that hasn't been quite told before in this way, and I really hope the market likes it.
Oh my goodness! Well, it certainly is. Like you said, like we were saying, it's a story about a great story, and the way that you four have put this together, the art, the prose, it's a fantastic thing, and it would be a great Christmas present for any aspiring Dungeons and Dragons players or just fans of popular culture in general. Michael, thank you so much again for being on Coffee with Kenobi.
Thank you, Dan.
Let's take our last break and close out the show. This is Coffee with Kenobi.
Listening to Coffee with Kenobi, you are the podcast you're looking for. This is.
Before we get to email, I want to thank our CWK sponsors, TeePublic, One Nation Coffee, Harry's Razors, and Mouse Fan Travel. Please support them the way they support our podcast. And remember to listen to new and archive shows of Coffee with Kenobi wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Stitcher, Spreaker, Overcast, Blog Talk Radio, Player FM, or our website, www.coffeewithkenobi.com. And if you listen to the show through iTunes, please leave us a review. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Pinterest, and Tumblr, and we'd love for you to check us out there. Also, be sure to listen to our CWK family of shows, including Legends Library, Rebels Reactions, Comics with Kenobi, and Lattes with Leia. Please leave a review for each of their shows as well, and be sure to subscribe to each of them individually, as they all have their own feeds now. That's going to do it for show number 152 of Coffee with Kenobi. Thank you so much to Michael Witwer for joining me and talking about Dungeons & Dragons Art and Arcana. It really is an amazing book. You're going to love it. Be sure to check it out. And I want to make sure to thank each and every one of you for joining me today, especially on your holiday. That's really, really great. It's great to spend time with my Star Wars family, and I appreciate you, and I'm very thankful for each and every one of you. In addition to the places I just mentioned for Coffee with Kenobi, you can find me twice a month on the podcast Looking at Lucasfilm, part of the Jim Hill Media Network, as well as on Twitter at Mr. Zeher, MRZEHR, and you can find my writings on CWK's website, as well as StarWars.com and IGN. Thanks again for joining us, and don't forget to check out www.patreon.com/coffeewithkenobi to help support the show, as well as get access to our CWK pour-over, including a very special Thanksgiving episode, which just dropped today as well. There are also t-shirts, coffee mugs, and much more. Have a great, happy, and safe Thanksgiving weekend. I will see you next time. This is the podcast you're looking for.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.
There's no one here. Move along.